So, good afternoon. We're live for this e-memoir session. What apprenticeship training providers need most during the coronavirus crisis. The session is going to be led by Beach Kaczmarczyk, and as ever, we like to keep the webinars as interactive as possible. So feel free to use a question or chat facility at any point throughout the duration of this webinar. You do not have to wait until the end. If you're watching this on a video recording, welcome. If you have any questions, then our contact details will be available on the final slide. I'd encourage you to share this video recording and the slides, which you'll all be receiving, with your colleagues. So get in touch. We're always happy to help. So without further ado, I'm going to mute my microphone and hand over to Beej. Keep the questions coming all. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Beej.
Thanks very much, then, and good afternoon to everyone. And hope that in these unprecedented times, you're all keeping well. The title of this webinar, which is, I suppose, looking at everything to do with apprenticeship training and the situation that we as apprenticeship training providers find ourselves, is very much from the point of view of a provider's perspective. As some of you know, I'm a director of a couple of companies which are involved in as independent training providers, as well as the chairman of a board of a medium-sized college with a very large apprenticeship provision. I think what I'm going to be looking at is really from the point of view of business continuity and survival. I think we all know what the most obvious response to that question is. We all need to stay safe and healthy. That's us, our learners, our employer partners, as well as obviously our own staff, as well as obviously those people that have a stake in our businesses and what we do. I think I also want to just stress that although a lot of this will be looking at from the perspective of independent training providers, remember, independent training providers are a vast range of providers, from companies, businesses, charities, third sector, voluntary organizations, as well as other forms. So I think it's important that we see the apprenticeship training providers as a very broad range of providers, including colleges, local authorities, etc., as well as our employer providers. So what I wanted to do was set the scene here by looking at some of the problems that we are facing as apprenticeship training providers. And I know from looking down the list of attendees, we have a fair mix of people here today, and it's good to see that you're taking part in today. I want to look at some of the forms of support that are available for grant-funded learners and providers, because I think that sets precedents and models of how providers can be supported, which I think are very important for us who provide apprenticeship provision as well. Looking at the supplier relief updates, which I think many of you listened in to a webinar by our colleagues over with Nick Linford last week. I want to look at what the furloughing of apprentices involves and an update on that, and then really sort of sum up all the things that we certainly as a training provider are looking for that I think will sustain us through these difficult times. And then maybe a quick look at what might be the future. Just want to quote what one of our partners said in one of our forums recently. Relaxation of the rules, that's the rules relating to apprenticeships, might not be enough. What we need is financial support. And I think that's a message that we've got to get through to everyone that is involved in the funding of apprenticeships, in the quality assurance of apprenticeships. So this is for the DSFA, DFE, and obviously the Institute for Apprentices. And I think one of the things that really starts us off on this is, well, what's the current position for us as apprenticeship training providers? We know that for employers, whether it be levy paying or non-levy paying, the business situation is quite significantly difficult. It's, you know, many of them have faced difficult decisions with the staffing, etc. But and I think those are well rehearsed and well understood. For us as apprenticeship training providers, whether you're the one person that runs their own apprenticeship training company, or a large college, or a large training provider with maybe several hundred staff with maybe thousands of apprentices, I think we know that a lot of those issues relate to these four basic headings. The financial issues, the obviously because apprenticeship funding is based on activity, you're paid retrospectively against the activity that you've been doing, whether it be on program or completion. We know that those earnings have been and will be significantly affected with the downturn in activity in the economy. This creates cash flow problems. Many of us are living on very low margins. Those margins are now disappearing. That means we have to borrow. And obviously what also complicates matters is that some of us are also multi-funding source. So we are partly grant funded, we are a subcontractor to grant funded, we're directly funded for 16 to 19, we have apprenticeship funding, we have commercial income, and some of these are guaranteed, that's great, others are not. And this means that even in an organization that looks reasonably sound financially because it has a significant amount of adult education or 16 to 18 provision, it can mean that parts of that organization there is less certainty about funding and therefore a different solution needed. And I think the most important issue for many of us is, of course, business continuity. For our learners, it's about what's going to happen in terms of disrupting their programs, in terms of their progress, their achievement. How do we fit in all the on-the-job training when they are furloughed, made redundant, on shorter hours, or are having to have unpaid leave? What are the implications of all of these from off-the-job training and the requirements to deliver 20% of the total amount of time, the work time? How are we going to complete English and maths for frameworks and standards? For standards, are we going to get the learners through the gateway? If they're ready for the endpoint assessment, when's that going to happen? There's a lot of disruption there too, and we know about that. What about the general support and well-being of our apprentices, and obviously the concerns that they have if they've lost their jobs, if they can't carry on with their learning, if they're having to be, for example, furloughed, or if, for example, they're designated to support someone that needs shielding. And of course, that's got big implications for retention of apprentices, and that's obviously got penalty implications in terms of funding and the completion of those apprentices. And will we ever recover those apprentices that have had significant disruption? In terms of our engagement with employers, we know that levy-paying employers will continue to pay the levy, it's part of the tax, but will they continue to support their learners? We have obviously the issue about non-levy-paying employers who, are giving us who are relying on the 95% support they get from the government, and if they're obviously struggling, that means that flow of income is not going to come into us. What's going to this mean for new starts, particularly new starts that came after the 1st of March, after the 28th of February, who might not be eligible to be furloughed? We've already talked about continuing learners. I think the most important issue for us is how are we going to continue to access the employers, that relationship that we've built up through our workplace tutors, our mentors, and obviously their staff, and what this means for future customer relations. We'll be able to reconnect with those employers that already a lot of effort has gone into to get that relationship going. And obviously we can get a little bit of help from the apprenticeship service to make that connection possible, but even there, employers will not necessarily feel that they want to reserve, for example, apprenticeships for the future when they don't know what the future is. And that's all got very significant implications for our resources. How do we retain our experienced workplace tutors, mentors, and subject specialists? And how do we get them back when, for example, business picks up, if it does pick up? How do we maintain their skills through continuing professional development, although there might be more opportunities to do that, but also what's happening to the morale and well-being of our staff? And of course, in future, that might also limit access to industry standard resources because those industries might not be there. They might have other priorities. Training might not be their #1 priority when they're trying to, for example, reserve and conserve their labor force as much as they can. And for some of us who have invested significantly in estate, this has got significant issues about whether that estate is going to pay for itself and how well is it going to be utilized. So I think the question I'm posing to each one of you is, how is your organization faring right now? And have you done the sums? And I know some of you will have already indicated to me that business continuity is going to be very difficult. I think one of you has already told me you're going to be a much smaller organization after this. But obviously there are significant issues here in terms of our cash flow and our ability to sustain our businesses, particularly if the only thing you're depending on is apprenticeship funding. So that's a nice open question to you. And a couple of you already commented on how well your organisation is faring right now. And one of you has told me that, I'm just reading it, thank you, less reliant on apprenticeships, but nevertheless it does affect up to 50 of your staff. Well, I know your organisation, and from the size of your organisation, that maybe is about, 5 to 10% of your total staffing are adversely affected by this. Nevertheless, that needs to be managed. If not now, certainly in the next few months. So thanks for those comments. I've just sat down thinking about some of the apprentices that we employ, because obviously some of us are also employing apprentices. And when I look at the sort of issues that they're facing, on the left-hand side, the worst, of course, of those is that they're made redundant and therefore can't carry on their apprenticeship unless we can find an alternative employer. I'll look at some of the relaxations that we are looking for on that. Some have been told to work from home. Well, how do we keep in touch with them if they're working from home if our main contact point has been a works email address, etc., and if they've got other priorities, such as looking after someone? Those that are furloughed, I'll look at. Those on reduced hours, again, how do we, that's a reality for many of our apprentices. Some, of course, have been told that they're going to be paid, they have to take unpaid leave. And by the way, if it's unpaid leave, in effect, these are the learners that we're going to have to take a break in learning, and obviously they can resume their learning when they come back to work after the period of unpaid leave. By the way, unpaid leave is not the same as furlough. What about some of our apprentices who have been furloughed and are now volunteering? How can you use the volunteering to build aspects of their training which might contribute to their apprenticeship? For example, we watched this morning a chef that's been furloughed by his restaurant chain, who's volunteering to run chefing and catering facilities in hospitals. Now that's a really good set of experiences he's getting, but he's not technically employed by that hospital. How can we use all of that extra experience to contribute towards the completion of that person's apprenticeship? Some of our apprentices will, of course, have to take a break in learning because they are ill, and not necessarily coronavirus, but maybe other associated things. Some have had to give up work and therefore learning to care for others. Some are involved in shielding and having to stay home because maybe someone in the home needs to be shielded. There are also our apprentices who are key workers, who are telling us that because they're key workers, they haven't got time at the moment for training, and the 20% off the job simply won't apply. That's got to be dealt with, even though they're going to continue in work. Can they continue in learning? And it isn't just about breaks in learning. That is not the only solution, although some people would want us to do that because it saves significant funding. Then at the other end of the spectrum are the problems that we've got to support those apprentices. If, for example, our tutors are ill or our tutors have been furloughed and the learner is still looking for that support, how do they get that support? As well as the issues that some of our learners on standards are facing in terms of being able to complete their endpoint assessment. So I think this one is what we call a multifaceted problem. And I think that thanks, Leslie, for what you've said, and I think obviously you're reflecting what is a significant issue there. But I think what it does is it also gives us a sense of the need for us to have alternative ways of keeping in touch with our apprentices, whether it be online learning, e-learning, but also different ways of assessing learners, particularly if the endpoint assessment is no longer possible because that isn't a functioning organisation or hasn't got staff to conduct the assessments, for example, invigilators or observers, etc. And we need to think about alternative solutions. So I think all of these multifaceted aspects of impact on our ability to sustain and continue in this market. So given that we know what the problems are of employers, given we know what the problems are that we face as providers, and given the difficulties that apprentices face, because of this wide range of problems faced by all of these people, we actually need a combination of different solutions. And that's what I'm going to look at, is how do we get that best combination of these solutions? And what things do we also need to help us that haven't been yet implemented, such as supplier the supplier relief that might be really critical, I think, to the sustainability of this sector. So we need these different solutions, not only to maintain levels of activity now, but also in the future, to support skills development, which I think is going to be as important, if not more important, after this crisis, and also to ensure the survival of the apprenticeship training provider networks, which I think are critical for all of these things we're talking about. So I'm going to pick through some of those solutions and relate them to some of the things that you've said. But at this point, are there any other questions? Good to see that some of you, by the way, have already talked a lot about solving some of the problems for our apprentices, particularly those who are furloughed, through online learning. Some of you are talking about the amount of the financial difficulties of maintaining your own staff, how to maintain relationships with employers. We'll pick through that. I think just as important. But I think also, yeah, I think one of the things that I would certainly suggest is that this is certainly going to get us to think about novel solutions as well. So with that in mind, let me now move on to what we do know is available as support. And by the way, in each case, the link is on the bottom of the page. Now, this is very important for those of us with a mixed economy of funding sources. So you might be an FE college, a local authority, or you might be a training provider doing grant-funded work. You might also be subcontracting to a grant-funded provider such as a college or local authority. Well, this was updated, by the way, on the 3rd of April, because on the 23rd of March, section 5 of the actual document, now it's in section 7, by the way, so update yourself on this. This is a critical document because what it tells us, first of all, is that the ESFA understands that the financial implications of the coronavirus crisis have got these significant issues, but it's focusing on grant-funded providers. So this is basically guaranteeing that on the basis of what the profile is until the end of the academic year, which don't forget that's the end of July, not June, these profile payments will be guaranteed for colleges, local authorities, and other people who are funded by grants. But also, that's got implications for the subcontractors, because I know some of you listening in are also subcontractors to these grant funded, and therefore one of the conditions is that they must continue with the contracts with you, as it would have been if coronavirus hadn't existed. And of course, that also relates to the current year, but also it's guaranteeing what's going to happen next year. And that's important for those of you thinking about business continuity after the end of the academic year. They also relates to loan-funded learning organisation. That will continue to make the scheduled fee payments to all providers with a loans facility. Now, the one thing I just want to add as a note of caution here, this obviously is the way in which grant-funded providers are being treated to guarantee their financial stability. It sets a precedent, because what about those of us who are funded through contract or in part by contract? The other thing to note, by the way, if your organisation was already underperforming and had indicated so from its first returns, this doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to get all of the funding without having to make a repayment in terms of reconciliation or in terms of activity. So if you've already flagged up that you were struggling before the crisis to deliver the whole of your, allocation, then this isn't going to relieve you from that. And there will be some reconciliation and clawback at the end. Now, so that was a very important aspect, because immediately that sets the scene. And as a couple of you have already said, it's unfair to those of us who are not funded through grant, that does not give you any assurance. And I think also this relates very quickly to a much more significant issue. And that is that if different providers are being treated in different ways, this has got significant implications for what's going to be the structure post the coronavirus crisis. Because if you've got significant gaps, for example, if a large number of training providers go out of business, or a large number of voluntary sector organisations are not sustained, who's going to supply to those learners when they recommence or reconnect? So I think that's got some significant issues. Well, that's one aspect of the support. The second aspect of support was the supplier relief due to COVID-19, the procurement notice of 0220, a very important document that was covered by a webinar, as I said last week. Its primary purpose was to basically say that to those of you who are relying on contracts from people like the ESFA, from local authorities, from, for example, the mayoral combined authorities, that these were subject to some protection. And this is basically saying that to cover those suppliers who are at risk so that they can continue once the outbreak is over, it means that they're going to look at those suppliers. So, for example, it might be an independent training organization, and say to them, right, we are going to pay you as normal, based on obviously the flow of activity up to now, even if the service is delivered or disrupted or temporarily suspended. But it's only until the end of June. So this isn't necessary to the end of the academic year. And that obviously creates some inconsistencies when you've got some people being supported right through to the end of the academic year, when of course the funding would have been normally reconciled over the course of that year, but also someone being treated differently. This might change, but I think what was also important, and this is an important point from the supplier relief note, was the contracting authority, ESFA for example, could consider making advance payments to suppliers if necessary. Now, this is where you're going to see one of the inconsistencies that one of you has already suggested is coming out of this. The whole purpose of this was to ensure continuity, protect the provider network, for example, apprenticeship training providers, and the jobs in those providers, as well as the wider supply chain. So this is another form of support that's available, but is it available to apprenticeship training providers or for apprenticeship income? The other thing to note, by the way, is that in order to get the supplier relief, so if you've got a contract with, say, an atomic energy authority or a local authority, you as a supplier have got to then have an open book basis. So all of your data has got to be available so they can review it maybe on a regular basis. It's all contained within the financial agreements that are associated with supplier relief. Your cost data has got to be clear. So for example, have you retained the staff? If you've retained the staff, how much are you paying them? This is obviously means that you can't be covered by the coronavirus job relief retention scheme. And that means obviously that what you've got to do is also show that you're not making a profit from this, particularly if the income is coming in, your costs have gone down because of whatever, because you maybe have made people redundant or put them on unpaid leave or reduced the hours, and therefore you could theoretically earn a profit from it. The other thing is it really is making sure that the people that are being funded, so for example, if you're a college, your supplier relief might apply to, say, adult education that you're doing through a contract that you for a procurement. Then those staff mustn't be furloughed. If you're a training provider who's got some delegated, you've won a contract, it's been procured through a mayoral combined authority, so this is covered by this. Again, those staff have got to be fully employed on the assumption that they would be there to deliver that part of the contract. It means that other staff in your organization might not be, because they're not covered by the supplier relief note, and therefore you can have a mixed situation. And that, I'll give you an example. We've got some learners that are covered by a devolved AEB who will be supported by the mayoral combined authority through supplier relief. We've got apprenticeship staff and the learners who are, those staff there are being furloughed because we've not got that flow of income coming in through apprenticeships. So you can see that this is going to create different types of scenarios for different providers. And that's why we've got to look at all of these different methods of support. By the way, one issue about the supplier relief, it doesn't always mean that you will not be required in some cases, once reconciliation has been done, to actually pay back some of the money, where, for example, you've not been able to substitute, for example, with adults, you've not been able to substitute direct face-to-face by, for example, online learning or e-learning, then obviously, and if you've not been able to put maybe some of that learning on after the end of the crisis, then obviously that might lead to some recovery of funds, based obviously on the fact that there's an open book requirement. And it is important, any of you who are getting supplier relief for adult education, for example, is that you do make sure that you pay your staff, and you continue to pay them fully, as well as obviously any subcontractors. So where does this leave independent training providers? Well, it appears that unless you're involved in delivering, for example, adult education budget to a devolved authority, it appears that there is no supplier relief available for any apprenticeship income, right, because of the activity-based funding model. And that includes FE colleges doing apprenticeship work and obviously independent training providers. So you've got two sets of problems there. First of all, the ESFA is not confirmed yet whether it's going to use supplier relief for any of those contracts that it's issued for AB outside of the mayoral combined authorities. Some devolved authorities have looked at the Cabinet Office guidelines within PPN 0220, and they've decided to pay all the providers, including ITPs, until either the end of June, or in some cases, the end of July. In other words, although the government policy does say it does not allow payment for service in advance of delivery, which it claimed, it's actually said so in the note. And some mayoral combined authorities are actually doing that. So, for example, I've just chosen Liverpool. They'll continue any training providers. So if you're an ITP that's doing adult education budget, you will receive adult education payments to provide stability. And in some cases, that will be to the end of June, in some cases to the end of July. So there are contradictions in the guidelines. And as one of you said, it's very frustrating when supplier relief is not being applied across the board to all kinds of provision. And especially when, you know, it is fairly easy to gather that information about what your activity was. Particularly, and this is why I posed this for you. See, I mean, one of the questions they might say, well, it might be difficult to apply supplier relief to apprenticeship provision because it's not profiled the same way as say, adult education or loan-funded learners or whatever, or traineeships, although there's been no clarity on traineeships. Something else that we would certainly want some clarification is on what's going to happen to traineeships, because those are, in many cases, contracted. Not just grant funded, they're contracted, and that includes 19 to 24s by the ESFA directly, not through the mayoral combined authorities. So have you got any thoughts? I know a couple of you already expressed this would be an obvious way of giving you financial security and ensuring that we could continue to supply apprenticeship training. We know that there are different ways of engaging with those adults, for example, through online learning, etc. So how could supplier relief be applied to apprenticeship provision? I mean, you know, I've got one suggestion. We could take, for example, for non-levy paying employers, which in our case is the bulk of our apprenticeship provision. We have just under 3,000 apprentices. We could just take the last 3 months of validated data through the ILR on on-program activity, average it out, and then pay us that each month. That would give us a lot of stability, and it means for those staff that are associated with those learners that are coming to us from non-levy paying employers, we could at least guarantee that we wouldn't have to furlough them, and we would find a range of ways of supporting those learners. As long as, of course, they're not having to, their employers or themselves are not having to take the breaks in learning. So have you got any other ways that you can suggest? Take the average of the same period last year. Thank you, Leslie. Well, by the way, we're going to keep a note of these, and when you get the slides, you'll find that we'll have all of these suggestions. So the average of the same period last year. And in some cases, that would be ideal. It would give you some stability. Of course, last year might have been a better year than this year. It could have been a worse year. But yes, that's a good suggestion. Thanks, Leslie. Any other ideas there? If you've just used the chat facility to give us some suggestions. One of you has noted, but this would only be on program support. What about the completion payments? That's a more difficult issue because obviously in some cases, completion, we could use again, what was your average completion rate from last year? It's more difficult when we don't know whether they've got through endpoint assessment, particularly if you've run it for the first time this year. So there's no sort of history yet. Any other suggestions? I'm just having a look. I think with levy paying employers, of course, levy paying employers they've had to pay into the, it's a tax, so they have to pay that as they would normally. One of the issues there is that some of them are saying, well, can they extend the 24-month expiry, because they might not be able to use it all up. I think that's a good point, because obviously if they've had to not carry on in learning and you're invoicing them and they're not paying you, in effect it means that you are hoping that they will pay you when they resume, but that means that they might have used up because of the 24-month expire. I would think one of the asks that we certainly would have to be making of the ESFA is that the 24-month expiry of levy funds for levy paying employers is relaxed. Good point. Any other suggestions? Trust us, we'll do more of our own observation of learners on standards, and therefore should be able to get them through to the endpoint assessment, and through endpoint assessment, if we use more observation by tutors and by, so that's a good point, we'll make a note, more reliance on observation to complete endpoint assessment. And is that using employers and your tutoring staff? Yep. Some of that might have to be virtual. Raises some interesting issues. So that's the second, if you want, of the main planks. Again, I think we've got to push as a sector to have supplier relief applied to apprenticeship provision. And I know that Mark Dawes at the AELP is certainly pursuing that. I hope that the AOC also pursues that. The third plank in this, and this has actually been quite a lot of emphasis has been put on this, has been on the relaxation of apprenticeship rules. And in particular, some of those rules that, it's slightly, I think this is one that you've got to think about. The rules themselves are into two groups. One is much more around the funding issues and the way that you, and any breaks in employment and breaks in learning. The other is very much about assessment. Just looking at that first set, this is the updated coronavirus guidance, by the way, which has just came out on Monday. And I think what it does raise for us is this additional point about flexibility for furlough. And I'm going to look at furlough because furloughing apprentices basically means apprentices on an extended break leave of absence. So they continue to be employed, but obviously the funding for their wages is coming through an 80% grant. I'll pick up that in a minute. But for example, a lot of the relaxation is actually something that we've welcomed for a long time, which is to deliver a lot more of our training to apprentices remotely through things like e-learning, onlining, distance learning, as far as is practicable. I think we would certainly, and from your responses, many of you have already done that, and in fact, you're going to do more of it as you're encouraging, thank you, as you're encouraging your apprentices to develop those skills. Of course, the big issue here is that we've always had a problem with audit evidence. We've had this with, for example, providing the audit evidence for 20% off the job, delivered in part, not wholly, but in part through things like online learning. I think what's most important here is that they relax the audit evidence requirements. We have got to get away from this. It's got to be face-to-face. That isn't what the world is going to be like now, and is going to be very much in the future. So I think that problem should not exist. And I think to some extent that's great that the ESFA is suspending a lot of the audit checking, etc. That I think is not going to help at all in the current situation. But in the future, I think we need to have a clarity about how much more we could be doing through that. So that's a great solution. I think the second one is enabling employers and training providers to report, initiate, and break in learning. where we can do it before, obviously, because obviously under apprenticeship rules, it's always the learner, the apprentice, that has to initiate a break in learning. However, I think there's an overemphasis on breaks in learning as a solution. And I think, so what we've got to do is have a model which says, right, if anything, the break in learning, if it's going to be initiated by us, if it's going to be obviously more than 4 weeks, because remember, if it's less than 4 weeks, it's not a break in learning, then I think we've got to make sure that we understand what the financial implications are, because that means that it will suspend payments to us. And from the ESFA's point of view, that would be great, because it actually means they have to spend less with us on our apprenticeships. I think Anne's also making a good point here about, again, a lot of apprentices are not going to be able to complete a lot of the things that they want to do because of the rules that apply to things like when do you have to complete your apprenticeship in terms of your contract of work, etc. I think a lot of these rules that relate to, for example, you've got to do everything within 3 months, 12 months, within 3 months, which is 12 weeks. You've only got so much, if you're made redundant, again, 12 weeks. We need to suspend these and think about them in different ways. I think the clarification about those learners that took, the break in learning occurred in March, but you'd obviously, I think that was great, because if the learning was disrupted in March, if you had to suspend the training before the end of March, we included those learners in the March ILR as being on program, so as to get funding, but you've got to retain the evidence of that. If no learning, by the way, took place in March, can I just add, if you had no learning taking place in March and you've put the person onto the March ILR, still being as having received on program support, then obviously there could be a recovery of that funding later on. If this is applied, if the break in learning occurred after the beginning of April and it's for more than 4 weeks, then you'll have to record the break in learning as a pause, and no funding will be claimed until they return. I think the other one that I'm finding a little bit difficult is the confirming that if apprentices are made redundant, then we try and find alternative employment. Now that should be us, the providers, ESFA through the apprenticeship service, and the learner, of course. The problem I've got with the 12 weeks is we can continue to continue their apprenticeship, and we can continue to claim funding for them. Is 12 weeks in the new situation, in this situation, going to be long enough? And I would certainly want to see a relaxation. I think it might be 6 months in some cases, because I think it's going to be that long before a lot of things are back into recruiting staff, etc. We don't know what the levels of unemployment are going to be like. And as Anne's picked up also in her note to me, and I'll just remind ourselves, some employers have penalties in employment contracts if apprentices don't complete 2 years of service after apprenticeship's been completed. Apprentices, at least in one employer, they have not been in a position to leave within the 2-year period. I think also what it does raise for me is relating to the next bit, which is what's the relaxation of rules around assessment, and in particular endpoint assessment. Well, I think, and one of you has already highlighted the inconsistencies here. If we're going to use, for example, teachers' predicted grades for A-levels, GCSEs, etc., why aren't we doing this for endpoint assessment? And I think I've made a strong case several times now, if our apprentices are being assessed by us and our employer, and we've been doing it for the last year, the last 18 months, in some cases the last 2 years, surely those judgments would be valid toward the endpoint assessment grade. And I think especially when we've been using observation by our staff and observation by the employers. So I think you're making a lot of good points there. And these are points that certainly to highlight as well. So I think that, so there's 3 things here. Endpoint assessment arrangements, so that there'll be more opportunities for remote assessments, wherever practicable and possible. I think it's important that the quality assurance of the endpoint assessment organizations doesn't have too strict, a set of assumptions. I'd have loved if there was only one endpoint assessment quality assurance organization, which has said this is a standard approach to endpoint assessment, which can include remote assessment, can include simulation, it can include observation, it can include end tests, it can include all of the bits and pieces, but it had the right emphasis on what was independent and the independent element of it. Clarifying that apprentices are ready for assessment but can't be assessed, can have their endpoint assessment rescheduled. It's got to, you know, and that means if it's an extra 12 weeks, I don't think in some cases 12 weeks is going to be long enough, because if this situation goes on after, very much after May, I think we might be looking at a much longer period for that to be done. And then obviously it's the same in terms of anyone whose gateway is delayed, either in completing the gateway, the on-program support, the off-the-job training that's required, the GCS, the functional skills that might be required, or maybe the external qualification, which is not feasible now, then I think all of those are very important. So you can see that the relaxation is helping out on things like the breaks in learning. It's helping out on the furlough, which I'm going to pick up now. It's also helping out on apprenticeship assessment. But is it enough? And the answer is no. And I think the answer is we could have done with that security of funding that would have been the supply of relief that we were looking for, that's been applied to other forms of contractual work that are completed by providers, including colleges and ITPs. So what else is available? Well, we mentioned financial support. This was the next strand, and very often you get answers from people saying, the ESFA in particular, saying, well, you could use breaks in learning, you can use, furloughing, or you can just borrow. Well, the Corona Job Retention Scheme for furloughed employees, I'll pick up in a minute. Obviously, that gives you relief for your staff who are not going to be employed in supporting apprentices. And I'll just mention how that works. And I think that thanks very much, Anne, for supporting me in this 12 weeks, because I mean, you know, there's going to be some providers and some employers that for the first 12 weeks are just simply going to be rebuilding their businesses, you know, after, and caring for apprentices might not be the priority. I think that the deferring VAT and self-assessment is going to be very important payments for a lot of us who are small and medium-sized businesses as training providers. Some of the other forms of support, yes, they'll help a little bit, but not every training provider is going to fit into these categories. I think many training providers are going to have to borrow, and that's why I've highlighted that. That's taking obviously time to come through, and there's delays on that. And of course, some businesses will go out of business in the meantime. But also, I think we've got to get that general feeling that that we need time to be able to get ourselves round, our heads round what the implications are. And if we're trying to retain staff and retain business continuity, paying VAT, paying other forms of taxation might not be the number one priority. I think the big danger here is that without some of this financial support, there will not be any training provider network in some areas that's substantive and enough to then pick up the work when things return to whatever the new normality is. The other danger is we are almost all involved in the supply chain. So we're not only buying a staff time, we're buying physical resources, we're buying electricity, we're buying gas, we're buying materials, etc. The danger is that we might hold back on paying those. We might have people who are agency staff or self-employed that we also start to slow and not make those payments, and that's got a knock-on effect. So I think this reliance on the breaks in learning, because that supports the learners, gives them the time to do the other things that they're doing, to be able to not worry too much about the learning when they're, for example, made redundant, or if they're on, if they're ill, or if they're on unpaid leave. But what I think is that over-reliance on that, plus the relaxation, isn't really addressing the major issue, and that is that we need to have some of the support that's been applied to grant-funded providers and particularly supplier relief. Now, the furloughing of staff and obviously the furloughing of apprentices, some in our own operation because we employ apprentices who we've furloughed, but also you've had to furlough some of your staff. Well, the coronavirus job retention scheme, that's a grant that's available for up to 80% of the usual monthly wage costs to a maximum of $2,500 per month. By the way, this is before tax, so just to remind you about that. Your learners, by the way, your staff had to be employed on or before the 28th of February of this year, so therefore they had to be on the PAYE payroll. Anyone that's a new start after that is not covered by this scheme. It's only a temporary scheme, so it applies from the 1st of March, but it might be extended. I think it will have to be extended. Now, if you're working, this applies to your own staff, so obviously this could give you some way of supporting your apprenticeship training staff, your workplace assessors, your workplace tutors, your mentors, so you can keep them on the books, you can keep them within your payroll, you can keep them at least give them some source of income. By the way, you can make up the difference between 80% and what they would normally have got. That's got to come out of your own resources. Now, if apprentices are being furloughed by their employers, that could include you, they can at the same time continue with their training. However, you must make sure that during the period of their training, and by the way, that would be off the job training since they're furloughed. Remember, if they're furloughed, they're not actually going to work, and they mustn't be providing services to or generating revenue for their employer. The question one of you has asked me, can furloughed apprentices volunteer? Yes. Can they work for someone else? Yes. Yes, that's possible because they might do. You might find that some furloughed apprentices are split. So they might be employed by one employer but furloughed by another. However, any of those must receive at least the apprenticeship minimum wage, depending on their age, the national living wage, or the national minimum wage as appropriate. It all depends on age, as you know, and you've got that. And if there is a shortfall between the 80% and the minimum wage or the apprenticeship minimum wage, you've got to make up the difference. Now that's just a bit of clarity there. However, it is now clear that we can furlough apprentices, and therefore I think you can continue to support them. This will be the off-the-job training, and as one person said to me recently, the 20% is not going to be an issue with furloughed employees because we'll be able to 50%, 60% of the time. Can I just remind you, any training that you deliver to those furloughed learners must still be still delivered in what would have been the normal working hours, even though they're not at work. And obviously make sure you've got records of that, whether it be open distance learning, blended learning, or whatever other means you're using. Contacting them during the work, what would have been the work time. This raised an issue, by the way, for some of us, because some of our apprentices, the only address we have is their email address at work. We've obviously had to get their details for their home email addresses or other forms of connecting with them, such as phone or whatever, because they're not all got email availability. So, so redundant employees can be re-employed by you and then put on furlough. Employees working reduced hours are not eligible for this scheme. Employees who are self-isolating or on sick leave are not eligible for this scheme. They're usually on statutory sick pay. Employees who are shielding, that's staying at home with someone who's in one of the categories, or with caring responsibilities, are, by the way, eligible for coronavirus job retention scheme. So I think that is one way that it's helping us with our own staff, but also helping for you to keep in touch with those furloughed apprentices. By the way, the coronavirus job retention scheme payments won't start until after the end of this month. I think it's after the 29th of April. So quite a lot of training providers are saying, well, wait a minute, we've been struggling to pay March's wages. We're also going to be struggling to pay April's wages. But it will be obviously affecting anyone that's been affected since the 1st of March. My feeling is that this might have to be extended beyond that. So I think that's another way of supporting us. I think all of those are what I'd call the financial support. So if I just go back through them, you know, look at them, they've all helped, they're all going to help providers stay in business. There's the grant funded that's going to colleges, local authorities, but also to their subcontracted partners, which includes obviously independent training providers. Then there's the supplier relief, which isn't available to us at the moment as apprenticeship providers, but should be. And that's a big thing we need to make a case for with the ESFA. The relaxation affects us all. I don't think that's going to help too much. It might just lessen some of the loads, particularly in terms of audit. But I think the danger with too much reliance on breaks in learning is that it actually does lead to funding issues for us. The relaxation of apprenticeship rules that relate to assessment, I think there's a lot to be done here that goes beyond this crisis about how we can actually have much more emphasis on what's done by our workplace tutors and by employers, and particularly to make the case for observation in the workplace as being a stronger element of this. But again, these are all going to help. Financial support, loans, we've mentioned that. The coronavirus job retention scheme, absolutely critical for a lot of us, with a very high emphasis, a high proportion of our staff employed in apprenticeships. The only way we can keep them at the moment and keep them fresh to some extent, because the danger is with redundancy and other forms of breaks in employment is that those people might not come back to us. We might lose those skills. I think the other thing to note is that is just a general sort of issue about how we can support apprentices generally during the crisis, because obviously the face-to-face contact that was there between the workplace tutor and the apprentice, those are not going to happen in most situations. So I think, as some of you have already flagged up, the way that you've managed to retain the connection with them, with those apprentices, has been through telephone, through emails, through blended learning, through WhatsApp, through Instagram, through Facebook, through Zoom. I mean, we're using Zoom today. I think the most important thing is this: to keep our apprentices, whatever the context they're in, including those who might be on unpaid leave, etc., where we've had to say there's a break in learning, is we've got to keep in touch with them. We understand that you might be sick. We understand that you've unpaid leave. We might understand you're a carer, but we are still here to support you. And if there's anything we can do to help you, but to record all of these activities. I think using online learning and e-learning to cover knowledge-based elements, particularly where in some cases we can do a lot more than the 20% of the job with furloughed learners, with furloughed apprentices, is absolutely critical, but it's going to be appropriate. And I think one of the things that this highlights also is that we've got to make sure that that is helping us to assess their progress. There could be what I'd call more creative approaches to endpoint assessment. We've already looked at that, and thanks for your suggestions. I think this is a golden opportunity, and I know we did this with our apprentices when we knew that a lot of them were going to be furloughed, and also that we weren't going to have as much contact with them and their employers. Research projects that extend their learning, particularly those that are on endpoint assessment who might be wanting to get a better grade. We have provided mentor support and reassurance by phone, by email, etc., by Zoom. But I think one of the other things is not to lose sight of the fact a lot of our apprentices are needing additional support. And I know that one of you has already highlighted that, how are we making sure that the well-being of our apprentices is being monitored? How are we making sure that those learners with individual needs are getting some kind of support? And I think it's absolutely appropriate point you've made there, Jennifer and Gordon, is that we definitely have to make sure we do not lose sight of that constant contact with the learning, but also the morale, the mental well-being, the physical well-being is absolutely critical. My advice to you is, whether using Smart Assessor, ePortfolio, on one file, whatever system you're using, is to keep records of all of the learning, all the contacts that are being undertaken, to demonstrate if, for example, we do get supplier relief, there will still be the need to show that you're expending the same costs. All of these activities mean that our staff will be employed in some capacity. And if we're going for supplier relief, when those staff, they'll be basically paying us on the basis of the last 3 months of activity or the average of last year's activity, is critical. But even for the other situations, even if we're using, and we can't use furloughed staff for this because don't get furloughed staff can be involved in training, can be involved in volunteering. One point, by the way, is if they're involved in volunteering, how do we record all of that? I think our volunteers, any furloughed apprentices that are volunteering, like for example, the chef, any of these means can be used to keep in touch with them, to keep recording, even if they're recording what they do by their mobile phone and say, I've just done this, or I've just managed that as a volunteer, is absolutely vital. And I think we're going to have more access to a wider range of things that we need to do. But one point to make is, and I think, yeah, it's a good point you made about audit of learning support, is that learning support, even if it's a 15-minute conversation with someone, log it, right? Especially if they're still on program and they haven't got a break in learning, because then you can demonstrate that you've earned the £150 for learning support for that particular month. So I think what I'm saying is that there are different ways in which we can maintain the relationship with the apprentice, and learning support is going to be one of those ways. That's great. Point of contact from our learning support team, log all contact. Yvonne, absolutely spot on. And that's going to be important for future audit. I don't think there will be as detailed an audit as we imagine, given these difficult circumstances, but just be aware that there could be some interesting questions about providing evidence of activity. So thanks for all of those things that you've highlighted there. So I think, just to sum up, what would really help, and my number one ask is, can we get a guarantee to all apprenticeship providers, including ITPs, that the current levels of on-program payments for both levy and non-paying levy and funded apprentices can be at least, and particularly for non-levy, because that's where the ESFA is responsible for 95%, that we are able to sustain ourselves through this difficult time and support apprentices to complete their programs when they come back after breaks in learning, when they return to full-time work, when they're no longer furloughed. That's a number one. And that can be through any of the schemes. It could be through the supplier relief or whatever. But I think that's the main one. I think that also we should stop certain things in their tracks. This has told us that the transition from frameworks to standards might not be taking place now as quickly as possible. Let's not have an artificial deadline. Let's let that slip. And we've obviously got people who still need to complete their functional skills, and we should maybe extend the legacy functional skills for several more months, and have a different way of it. And after all, yeah, as one of you, Gordon, has said, we've got to make sure we do the right thing here. By the way, if an employer does not top up the furlough apprentices who are on minimum wages, will they then have to go into a break in learning? Yeah, because a furloughed, the condition is the furloughed learner must have a level of pay which is at least the minimum wage for an apprentice for their training. So that because they will be doing nothing but training when they're furloughed. So I think there's a key issue there about that won't allow it won't allow them to be able to secure the coronavirus, the CJRS. So if I just finish this and then I'll just pick up the last questions. I think we also need to take anything that's going to distract us from rebuilding our businesses. I think we've got to postpone the introduction of T-levels for another year, because I'm just as a T-level provider, where are we going to get the work placements when we can't get them for our apprentices who might have lost their jobs, etc.? This is not a priority of employers. As one of you said, many of the employers we're dealing with who are SMEs, etc., but even local authorities, etc., are having to rebuild the businesses on a different format from before. I think we've got to allow more flexibility in the ways of assessing apprentices, particularly their competence, and this extends into endpoint assessment. So I think we need to use simulations, tutor assessment, employer observation, all the things we talked about. We need to get that. And I think the IFA and the quality assurers there have got to look at that. I think we've got to allow a lot more flexibility around the on-the-job and off-the-job proportions. And I'll give you a classic example. A lot of the key workers that we, who are our apprentices, working for the local authority, working for certain sectors such as the health service, have not got time to do the 20% of the job at the moment, and therefore why are we asking them to do it? I think we can make that less of an issue at the moment. We might be able to pick up some of it in future, but I think we've got to be wary of that. I think we shouldn't just be relying on breaks in learning, because that's an easy solution, but not for us. It's an easier solution for the ESFA and the funders. And I think the other thing that's got to be clear is, if we're having furloughed apprentices, can we fund any training we do with them through the AEB? Because this would not be training relevant to their jobs. It might be a different forms of training. It might be to help them become volunteers. So I think there are some opportunities within the adult education budget, as long as the flexibilities that we need in the way it's applied, particularly to contracted AEB as opposed to grant funded. And I think the key message from subcontractors is that primes, especially FE colleges, got to honour your existing contracts and payments to subcontractors, because subcontractors are so critical for the supply of good quality AEB, traineeships and apprenticeships, and we really want to make sure that we support that network. So these are what I see as the key things. The number one is guarantee through the supplier relief at least a significant proportion of our income, and we'll pick it up through other sources, through those other means that's available. But what other things would you want to see that think would help you? Now, I think you've already given us some of those, but any other things that you think would help you through these difficult times, in addition to the things that you've already suggested? And by the way, thanks very much for the questions you've posed, as well as the suggestions. I'd like to take that suggestion forward about, you know, if we're now using predicted grades for GCSEs and A levels, why not for others? Thank you for that. Clear guidance to share with employers to prevent apprenticeship exploitation, to offset employer costs. Remember, a lot of the conditions here are that this is about learning, not about subsidizing the cost of the job, right? Other than obviously the 80% grant that's available for furloughed learners. And furloughed learners mustn't, furloughed staff are not to be involved in any activity which generates revenue. Yeah, additional support, I think, is one that's just missing in a lot of the things here. Trying to get audits sorted out so we're not hammered later on, good. Contacting learners through online. How do we make sure that learners are supported all the way through the program? Centralized guidance to share with apprentices who are panicking. Make sure, I mean, we're very lucky in that our three organizations that I'm involved in, we have a very good student services team that's helping all of our learners, because we are funded through AB, through 16 to 18, through loans and through apprenticeships. Thank you, thanks very much for offering a bit of sanity in this time of chaos. Thanks for that, Leslie. And I think what's important is that, you know, we do have to make sure that the people who act on our behalf, the awarding organizations, the AOC, the AELP, and other trade associations actually take notice of what we're saying and then present that as an effective set of solutions. But there are other things, you know, I'd like to see the 5% employer contribution for non-levy paying employers scrapped. I think that would help. I'd like to see a confirmation that we won't have financial assurance audits for a time being, that we're going to have a more lenient approach to the way that we interpret online learning. Any other sort of suggestions? Any other suggestions? Yeah, more guidance from our awarding organizations. The good ones do, and I'm associated with some good ones, so use them. And I think the other thing is that to some extent the government is finding its way through this, and we've got to be fair. This is something that they've never had to experience before. So I think it's important that they start to look at and review this, with us helping them as providers, and saying that maybe that's not worked, this has worked. We've got to make sure that whatever we're trying to ensure this is a good way of seeing what's been effective and what maybe should be done more of, but also what is not going to be so effective. So thanks again. Hopefully a nice way of guiding all the employers through this, a step-by-step guide to, we'll make a note of that. So a step-by-step guide, like a flow chart, very similar to what we've got for example, breaks in learning, that flow chart, which was really helpful to use with employers to help them navigate the situation, assist with audit evidence provision. Thank you very much for Anne. You've given us some great suggestions. I really appreciate that. Because ultimately, that's what we're going to have to do if we're thinking about the future of apprenticeships. We're going to see what worked, and it might also give us a little bit of time and also avoid some of the interpretations. A lot of the things that are being suggested still require careful interpretation. What gets me is the frustration of why doesn't the DfE extend supplier relief to all of us? That would certainly be the simplest, and I'm sure we've said it, as well as maybe answering some of our queries. So what about the future? I think the apprenticeship market, and this might be easier to do maybe in 2 or 3 months, I think it's going to look very different, hopefully, because we will remove some of the obstacles that actually just get in the way of engaging effectively with employers and their staff. I think it's going to look very different because I think quite a lot of providers will not survive, even though we've talked about some of the things today. If there's a delay in the application of some of the things we've talked today, we know that many providers were already thinking about the sustainability of this market. I think the recovering economy is going to need a whole lot of skills in a whole lot of areas. They could be very different. I think it's time we recognize that some of the most low-paid workers are in fact the most critical, and therefore, why don't we invest more in the skills of retail, distribution, caring, etc., and the ancillary trades. I think the demand for apprenticeships could be quite good if we recognize how that skill shortage has held us back in many of the things that we needed to do. But most importantly, I think we need a totally new system, and that will be the future of another webinar after Easter about what might be an alternative way of looking at the apprenticeship market. So if you want to contact us, do so. Ask us any questions, particularly if you're looking in on the recording. If you haven't taken up the advantage of the subscription service with eMemoir, that's the business that myself and my son run, then it's £250 plus VAT for a minimum of 30 webinars. It's a minimum of 30 webinars a year on a whole range of topics, and you can obviously suggest, and this is just an example of one of those webinars we've got. So are there any more questions before we close down the recording? Just want to thank everyone. Thank you. We've had loads of questions. Thank you very much for the feedback. Thank you. And thanks for all the questions that you've posed. And I'll go through the questions again. We will add some of the points that you've made to the slides where we've asked you to come up with suggestions. That's great. Thank you. Okay, Marek, can we close the recording down? Thanks to everyone. Stay healthy. And I wish you, if you're going to take and celebrate at home, by the way, with your close family or your partners this Easter, then stay healthy and stay home.